Before that, I did a tour in America in 1974. But in England, I never performed since the Beatles, which was 1960.
The music room at Friar Park is dim and warm, lined with guitars, sitars, and scattered lyric sheets. George Harrison sits comfortably, his manner calm as ever, yet there's a flicker in his eyes that hints at the edge beneath the surface. Though remembered by the world as the quiet Beatle, Harrison was never one to hold his tongue when pressed. Behind the gentle smile and meditative outlook was a man who could be, as he once admitted, calmly cutting when something rubbed him the wrong way. On this night, Harrison flips through memories, candidly recalling the artists and styles that never resonated with him. While he never sought out feuds the way some of his contemporaries did, when he felt strongly, his words could cut sharper than most. From dismissing entire genres as rubbish to mocking guitar styles that made his skin crawl, Harrison carried an honesty that was both refreshing and, at times, startling. "I wasn't trying to be mean," he might say with a shrug, "but sometimes I couldn't help myself." With a wry smile, he begins his list, starting with the music he respected the least and counting down to the one guitarist whose sound offended him more than any other. Number 5. Critique of Elton John, 1976.
Come by it. Well, I used to be in a band, and I wanted to become a singer in my own right, and I wanted to choose a name, and the saxophone player in the band.
By the mid-1970s, George Harrison had already carved out a reputation as the Beatle most willing to follow his own path. He immersed himself in Indian spirituality, wrote songs that spoke of love and transcendence, and sought depth in both his personal and musical life. That pursuit of authenticity often made him impatient with music he considered shallow or formulaic. So when Elton John's name came up in a 1976 interview with India Today, Harrison didn't hesitate to speak his mind. Elton John, by then, was arguably the biggest pop star on the planet. With albums like Goodbye Yellow Brick Road and Captain Fantastic and The Brown Dirt Cowboy, he was filling stadiums, dazzling crowds with flamboyant costumes, and topping charts around the world. To millions, he was a genius. To George, however, the music didn't quite measure up. "I never thought much of Elton John's music," Harrison admitted. "It all sounds the same." He went further, breaking down the formula as he saw it. Throw in lyrics, throw in 4 chords, shake well. It was a dismissive remark, especially coming from a man who was usually more reserved in his criticisms. Yet, it revealed how Harrison's ears had little tolerance for what he perceived as manufactured pop. It wasn't personal. Harrison had been friendly with Elton, even sharing stages and social circles at times. But George separated the person from the art. He could respect Elton's success, his showmanship, and his place in the industry, while still feeling unmoved by the music itself. What bothered him was the sense that Elton's songs, while catchy, lacked the kind of depth George craved. At the same time, Harrison's comments carried a trace of envy mixed with exasperation. Here was Elton dominating the 1970s with an output that seemed effortless, while Harrison, often struggling with critics, found his own solo work scrutinized for being too spiritual, too serious, or too uneven. To someone as introspective as George, Elton's glittering pop juggernaut may have felt like a mirror of everything he resisted in the music business. Still, Harrison wasn't dismissive of everyone in mainstream pop. In that same interview, he praised Smokey Robinson and Stevie Wonder, artists he felt wrote from the heart and carried authenticity in their craft. The contrast was telling. What Harrison disliked wasn't popularity or success, but what he saw as formula. When he listened to Smokey or Stevie, he heard soul. When he listened to Elton, he claimed to hear repetition. The reaction to Harrison's critique was muted at the time, perhaps because Elton himself wasn't one to ignite public feuds in return. But among fans, it reinforced an image of Harrison as someone unwilling to sugarcoat his feelings. He wasn't chasing headlines. He was simply being honest in the way only George could, quiet, yet sharp enough to sting. Looking back, the comments also highlight a deeper truth about Harrison's own philosophy of music. For him, a song had to be more than entertainment. It had to lift people, to speak of love, God, or the struggles of the human heart. Anything less felt disposable. That's why he could be so dismissive of what many considered classics. They didn't reach the level of sincerity he demanded. And yet, There's an irony here. Elton's music, loved by millions, continues to endure, just as Harrison's words endure as a reminder that even the most respected artists carry biases and blind spots. The honesty makes George's voice distinctive, sometimes harsh, sometimes unfair, but always authentic. It leaves us with a question worth pondering. When we call a song formulaic, are we dismissing genuine artistry or simply revealing the kind of depth we ourselves most crave in music? Number 4, Punk Rock Put Down, 1979.
So we'll start with 1970, and there were fewer like solos and stuff like that. It was a little more, had more like rhythm to it and percussion. So it would, like something like Velvet Underground was kind of like going down the boulevard with the flower.
By the late 1970s, the world of music had shifted dramatically. Punk had exploded in Britain, tearing up the rulebook with a raw, rebellious sound that stood in stark contrast to the polished production of mainstream rock. Bands like the Sex Pistols and The Clash sneered at tradition, dismissing the past and daring to say they were the future. For many young fans, punk was liberation, music stripped back to its bare essentials, fueled by anger and energy. But for George Harrison, it was little more than noise. In a 1979 interview with Rolling Stone, Harrison made his feelings abundantly clear. Asked about the new movement, he didn't hedge or offer polite dismissal. He said bluntly, "They're just rubbish. No finesse in the drumming, just a lot of noise and nothing." It was one of his sharpest public critiques, and it landed like a slap. For a man often called the quiet Beatle, his honesty could be startling. Harrison wasn't just criticizing the sound, he was also lamenting what punk seemed to represent. He recalled seeing members of the Sex Pistols on television saying they were destined for factory work. Instead of admiring their rebellion, Harrison found it awful. He pitied the hopelessness, the lack of aspiration. For someone who had always seen music as a form of spiritual uplift, punk's nihilism struck him as profoundly depressing. This wasn't simply a generational divide. It was philosophical. Harrison had spent much of the 1970s exploring Indian spirituality, singing about love, God, and transcendence. His songs urged listeners to give me love, give me peace on earth. Punk, by contrast, shouted about chaos, anger, and destruction. Where George sought harmony, punk reveled in discord. It's no wonder he found little to admire. Still, it's worth noting that George wasn't alone in this reaction. Many artists of his generation, including some of his former bandmates, were baffled or even offended by punk's stripped-down sound. To musicians who had spent years perfecting their craft, experimenting in studios, and pushing the boundaries of production, punk's three-chord simplicity felt like regression. For George, who had worked tirelessly on the textures of the Beatles' music, the rough edges of punk seemed careless.
Try and publicize it because most of the television and newspapers, all they ever talk about is Labour, Conservative, Liberal.
And yet, there was a paradox in his critique. Harrison had once been part of a band accused of causing the same kind of disruption. In the early 1960s, critics dismissed the Beatles as noisy, untalented upstarts who would fade quickly. They too were scorned for long hair, casual defiance, and the audacity to challenge the establishment. In that sense, punk was simply the next wave of youthful rebellion. Perhaps that's why his words carried an edge of defensiveness. He could see the resemblance, even if he disliked it. Harrison's comments also reveal his compassion, tucked inside the criticism. When he said it was awful to hear young people assume they were destined for factories, he wasn't mocking them. He was saddened by the lack of hope. For George, music was supposed to open doors, to expand horizons. Punk, in his view, seemed to trap people in despair rather than lift them out of it. Looking back, punk survived his dismissal. Its energy influenced countless genres, from grunge to indie rock. But Harrison's Put Down still echoes as an example of how even visionary artists can bristle at the unfamiliar. His honesty, though harsh, was rooted in his own values. Music should aspire to more than noise. And it makes you wonder, was Harrison's reaction proof of punk's failure, or proof that its raw honesty hit too close to home for an artist who once shocked the establishment himself? Number 3, The Hollies Feud, 1965.
Certainly wonderful to be here, and certainly a thrill.
George Harrison had a reputation for being soft-spoken, but when it came to his own music, he could be fiercely protective. In 1965, the Beatles were at the height of Beatlemania, but Harrison was still fighting to prove himself as a songwriter within the band. Lennon and McCartney dominated the credits, while George's contributions were fewer and often overlooked. So when another band covered one of his songs, poorly, in his view, he took it personally. The band in question was The Hollies, one of Britain's popular beat groups at the time. Known for their harmonies and radio-friendly hits, The Hollies were riding high on the charts. When they decided to cover Harrison's If I Needed Someone, it seemed like a compliment. After all, imitation is supposed to be the sincerest form of flattery. But George didn't see it that way. Preparing for a concert, Harrison was asked by a reporter what he thought of their version. Without hesitation, he shot back, "Rubbish." He insisted they had spoilt it and went further, criticizing their records for sounding like session men who just got together in a studio. The sting of his words was unmistakable. To him, their cover wasn't just uninspired, it was soulless. For Harrison, this wasn't about rivalry. It was about authenticity. He had poured himself into the jangly chiming sound of If I Needed Someone, a song heavily influenced by the Byrds' 12-string guitar textures. It was his attempt to carve out a distinct voice as a songwriter. When the Hollies flattened it into something he felt lacked chemistry, it was like seeing his work stripped of its soul. The criticism caused a stir. The Hollies were no minor act. They were contemporaries competing for chart space in the same musical landscape as the Beatles. To have one of the Fab Four dismiss them so bluntly made headlines. Graham Nash, then a member of the Hollies, reportedly took offense, later reflecting that George's words stung at a time when bands thrived on mutual respect, at least on the surface. But Harrison wasn't in the mood for politeness. He had little patience for what he considered assembly line music. In his eyes, great songs required chemistry between band members, a shared energy that couldn't be faked. The Beatles had it in spades, and he believed the Hollies lacked it. To him, their version of his song was technically fine, but emotionally hollow. It's easy to understand why Harrison reacted so strongly. As the third songwriter in the Beatles, he was already battling to be taken seriously. Having his work covered in a way he thought diminished, it must have felt like a step backward. His critique, then, wasn't just about the Hollies. It was about defending his right to be heard as a writer in his own right. History, of course, has been kinder to both sides. The Beatles remain immortal, and the Hollies went on to enjoy a long career with plenty of beloved hits. But Harrison's jab remains part of the lore. A reminder that behind the calm exterior was a man who refused to let his art be diluted without protest. And it leaves a question worth asking. When someone interprets your work in a way that feels lifeless, should you bite your tongue out of courtesy or speak out, even if it risks starting a feud? Number 2, dismissal of Oasis, 1996.
What's that band called that's playing here today?
By the mid-1990s, Oasis were being hailed as the biggest band in Britain since the Beatles. With swagger, swaggering songs, and the Gallagher brothers' endless bravado, the press pushed the idea that Britpop was the second coming of Beatlemania. For George Harrison, who had lived through the hysteria of the 1960s, those comparisons felt exaggerated at best, and insulting at worst. In 1996, during an interview, Harrison was asked what he thought of the Britpop phenomenon. He leaned back, his expression calm but laced with irritation, and gave an answer that cut straight through the hype. He said Oasis's music lacks depth, and when asked about Liam Gallagher, he didn't hold back. Liam is a pain. He added that the rest of the band don't need him. The bluntness of the remark sent shockwaves through the British press, already obsessed with Oasis's confrontational image. For Harrison, it wasn't just about one band. He had little patience for what he saw as shallow songwriting masquerading as greatness. The Beatles, whatever else could be said about them, had always strived for evolution. Each album pushed into new territory. Rubber Soul to Revolver, Sgt. Pepper's to the White Album. Oasis, in George's ears, seemed content to recycle familiar chords, leaning on attitude more than substance. To him, it was all bluster with little beneath the surface. His comment about Liam struck a particularly raw nerve. The younger Gallagher brother prided himself on being the reincarnation of rock and roll swagger, channeling Lennon's sneer and Jagger's strut. To be dismissed as unnecessary by an actual Beatle wasn't just criticism, it was humiliation. Liam, true to form, fired back angrily in interviews, calling Harrison a washed-up nobody, and claiming Oasis were bigger than the Beatles ever were. The spat became tabloid fodder, feeding the very machine Harrison disliked. But beneath the insult was something more thoughtful. Harrison was pointing to a recurring frustration in his career: the public's tendency to idolize attitude over artistry. He had spent decades trying to remind people that music should aspire to depth, whether spiritual, emotional, or technical. Oasis, with their loud proclamations and stadium anthems, struck him as the opposite of what he believed in. Still, it's important to note that George wasn't a snob about popular music. He loved rock and roll at its core and never dismissed accessibility. His problem came when the packaging outweighed the content. To him, Oasis's boastful interviews and constant Beatle comparisons were proof of ego without substance. They weren't breaking ground, they were basking in borrowed glory. The Oasis backlash also highlights something ironic. George, often labeled the quiet Beatle, was capable of some of the loudest put-downs. Where McCartney might have deflected with diplomacy and Lennon with wit, Harrison delivered his critiques with calm precision that cut even deeper. He didn't shout, he simply stated his view, and the sting lingered. Years later, Oasis themselves would admit that the comparisons to the Beatles were overblown. Even Noel Gallagher, the band's main songwriter, eventually acknowledged that they couldn't match the Beatles' innovation. In hindsight, Harrison's criticism seems less like petty dismissal and more like sober realism. And it leaves us with a lingering question. When a new generation imitates the legends of the past, is that homage worth celebrating, or does it become hollow when it lacks the depth and originality that made those legends timeless? Number 1. The Neil Young Rant, 1992.
I'm sure Eddie's brilliant and a great guitar player and wonderful. I just doesn't interest me.
Right.
For most of his career, George Harrison was known as the most diplomatic of the Beatles. He didn't go looking for fights, and compared to Lennon's sharp tongue or McCartney's occasional arrogance, George carried himself with calm, almost meditative restraint. But every so often, that calm gave way to a flash of brutal honesty. And in 1992, during a studio session with Dave Stewart and Bob Geldof, he let one of those flashes loose, aimed squarely at Neil Young. The session itself was casual, the kind of hangout where musicians tossed around ideas, laughed, and traded stories. At one point, Geldof brought up Neil Young's song Around the World. Expecting camaraderie, maybe even admiration, he instead got Harrison's unfiltered truth. Harrison paused mid-take, considered the question, and said simply, "I'm not a Neil Young fan." Geldof tried to push back, praising the track, but Harrison cut him off with a rare bluntness. "I hate it, yeah, I can't stand it." Then he went further. Mimicking Young's distinct guitar style, Harrison exaggerated the rough, jagged strumming, laughing as he did so. He told the story of being on stage during a live performance with Eric Clapton when Young launched into one of his trademark solos. George recalled glancing at Clapton with a look that said, "Don't look at me, it's not me." It was a moment of levity, but also of deep criticism. For Harrison, Young's guitar style wasn't just unappealing, it offended his musical sensibilities. Why such a strong reaction? Part of it lies in George's own musical philosophy. He valued finesse, melody, and what he often called taste in guitar playing. His own style was never about pyrotechnics or speed. It was about precision, choosing the right note at the right moment, letting space and silence speak as loudly as sound. Neil Young's raw, unpolished approach, the deliberate raggedness, the unpredictability, was the opposite of everything Harrison held dear. To George, Young's solos sounded sloppy, even careless. Where fans admired their intensity, George heard a lack of control. And because he took music so seriously, as a craft, almost as a form of prayer, what others found thrilling struck him as chaos. For a man who spent years refining his touch on both guitar and sitar, Young's roughness wasn't liberation. It was grating. The outburst was shocking because George rarely let himself sound contemptuous in public. He was more likely to shrug off things he disliked or redirect the conversation. But here, with trusted friends in the studio, he dropped the mask and revealed the full extent of his distaste. That he admitted Neil Young's style made his skin crawl says everything about how deeply it bothered him. Of course, Neil Young himself was no stranger to polarizing opinions. He thrived on being unpredictable, following his muse whether or not it pleased audiences or critics. In a strange way, the two men shared more in common than either might have admitted, a stubborn refusal to compromise their vision. Yet, where Harrison sought beauty, Young embraced dissonance. Harrison's rant has since become part of his lore, the moment when the quiet Beatle proved he wasn't afraid to be brutally honest when pushed. And it leaves us with the most striking question of all. Was George's dismissal of Neil Young a blind spot in his own openness to art? Or was it the sharp clarity of a man unwilling to settle for anything less than what he considered true musical taste? George Harrison's reputation as the quiet Beatle often painted him as the most reserved of the four, but as these moments show, quiet did not mean timid. When something struck a nerve, Harrison could be sharply dismissive, sometimes even cruel in his honesty. Elton John's songs, Oasis's bravado, The Hollies' cover, Punk's raw chaos, Neil Young's jagged guitar lines, none of it escaped his unfiltered judgment when he felt compelled to speak. Yet what's striking is how his criticisms always revealed something about himself. His dismissal of Elton John showed his distaste for formula. His feud with the Hollies revealed how protective he was of his own writing. His irritation with Oasis highlighted his intolerance for shallow songwriting. His punk put-down exposed his need for music to inspire, not depress. And his rant about Neil Young revealed how deeply he believed in taste, precision, and beauty in guitar playing. His dislikes weren't random, they were reflections of his own ideals. But Harrison was not a man of hatred. Even in his harshest critiques, he often circled back to a bigger truth. You don't fight negativity with negativity. You have to overpower hatred with love. For all his blunt words, his life's work was dedicated to music that healed, soothed, and transcended. The contradictions make him fascinating, calm yet cutting, spiritual yet sarcastic, quiet yet sharp when it mattered. As the camera drifts out of his Friar Park garden, Harrison strums a single chord and lets it ring. His voice lingers. Not every opinion has to be kind, but every life should strive for love. And it leaves us with a question worth holding on to. Do our harshest judgments say more about the world around us or about the ideals we carry within?